The winter of 1924 was the harshest London had seen in decades. The ground had frozen solid, turning the simple act of digging a grave into a test of will and strength. At Highgate Cemetery, Thomas Finch and his apprentice Oliver worked tirelessly, their breath forming clouds in the bitter morning air. Their spades struck the earth with dull thuds, barely making an impression on the frozen ground. "Never known it to be this hard," Thomas grunted, driving his spade down with all his weight. Oliver nodded, his young face red from exertion. "Perhaps we should wait for it to thaw, Mr. Finch." "The Wilsons won't wait," Thomas replied. "Their grandmother deserves a proper burial, frozen ground or not." With a particularly forceful strike, Thomas's spade suddenly broke through the surface, sinking deeper than expected. A hollow sound echoed from below. "That's odd," he muttered, driving his spade in again. This time, he felt the unmistakable give of wood beneath his blade. Thomas dropped to his knees, brushing away loose soil with gloved hands. "There's already something down here, Oliver." "Can't be," Oliver protested. "This plot is fresh. Never been used." "Well, someone's made a mistake," Thomas said grimly. "Help me clear this." They worked more carefully now, unearthing what clearly appeared to be the top of a wooden coffin, one that had no business being there. "Should we fetch Mr. Crawford?" Oliver asked, referring to the cemetery administrator. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "And tell him to telephone the police." When Detective Inspector James Wallace arrived an hour later, the scene had attracted a small cluster of concerned cemetery staff. Wallace moved with a pronounced limp, a permanent reminder of his service in the Great War. Despite that, he carried himself with quiet authority. "No one's touched anything?" he asked Crawford, the nervous cemetery administrator. "No, Inspector. We've left everything just as it was found." Wallace nodded and approached the partially excavated grave. The wood of the unexpected coffin had deteriorated, but it was clearly not a recent burial. "How long would you say this has been here?" Wallace asked Thomas. The gravedigger shrugged. "Hard to say exactly. The wood's seen better days, but the ground here preserves things. Could be 5 years. Could be 10. Wallace turned to Crawford. "I need to see your burial records for this plot." "Of course, but there must be some mistake," Crawford insisted. "This plot was sold to the Wilson family just last month. It's never been used." "Evidently it has," Wallace replied dryly. "I'll need a police surgeon and more men. We'll have to bring the coffin up." By midday, the unexpected coffin lay fully exposed. The police surgeon, Dr. Henry Morris, supervised as it was carefully lifted from the ground. The wood creaked ominously as they placed it on the frozen earth beside the half-dug grave. "Shall we?" Wallace asked, gesturing to the coffin lid. Dr. Morris nodded, and together they pried open the deteriorated lid. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a woman. Fragments of a once fine dress still clung to the bones. Dark hair remained attached to the skull. But most striking was the absence of any proper burial preparations. This was no official interment. No shroud, Dr. Morris noted. No preparation of any kind. Wallace nodded grimly. Someone wanted her in the ground quickly. His eyes caught something dark around the neck vertebrae. "What's that there?" Dr. Morris leaned closer. "Appears to be some sort of fabric. A scarf, perhaps." He gently probed the area. "It was used to strangle her." Wallace surveyed the remains with a practiced eye. Young woman by the look of it. Well dressed. This wasn't a pauper. He turned to Crawford. "I need records of all missing persons, particularly young women, reported in the last 7 years, interjected Dr. Morris, who was examining the degree of decomposition. "Give or take a few months. That's how long she's been here. 7 years. Wallace did the calculation. 1917. The middle of the war, when London's attention was elsewhere and police resources were stretched to breaking. "Right," Wallace said. "I'll need those records from 1917. As the remains were carefully removed for further examination, Wallace stood at the graveside, staring down at the empty space. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to hide this young woman away. Someone had counted on her never being found. The frozen ground had kept its secret for 7 years. Now, the bitter winter had given it up. The case file landed on Wallace's desk the next morning. He leafed through the sparse documentation. A report of a missing young woman, Elizabeth Harrington, filed reluctantly by her father 7 years ago, then quickly withdrawn when letters arrived indicating she had eloped with a young lieutenant. Wallace read the initial statement with interest. Sir William Harrington, a prominent barrister, had reported his 20-year-old daughter missing on February 12, 1917, after she failed to appear at breakfast. Her bed had not been slept in. Initially, he suspected she had followed through on what he termed a foolish romantic notion to elope with a young officer shipping out to France. The follow-up note, dated just 2 weeks later, was brief. Investigation no longer required as communication had been received from his daughter confirming her marriage and relocation to Scotland. Convenient, Wallace muttered. His sergeant, David Parker, appeared in the doorway. The dental records came through from Dr. Morris. They matched the Harrington girl. Wallace nodded, unsurprised. What about the effects found with the body? Catalogued them myself, Parker replied, setting down a typed list. 1 silver locket, tarnished but intact. 1 handkerchief, embroidered with the initials EH portions of a blue dress, good quality. 1 woman's boot, right foot. The left is missing. No ring. Wallace asked, scanning the list. No, sir. Family mentioned a sapphire ring in the original report. Family heirloom. Said she always wore it. Parker shook his head. Nothing like that with the remains. Wallace leaned back in his chair. Tell Constable Hughes to bring the automobile around. We're paying a visit to the Harrington residence. The Harrington home in Belgravia spoke of old money and quiet influence. A somber butler admitted them into a high-ceilinged entrance hall where portraits of stern-faced ancestors looked down disapprovingly. Sir William Harrington received them in his study, a room lined with leather-bound law books and smelling of pipe tobacco. Though in his 60s, he remained an imposing figure, his white hair precisely combed, his posture rigidly upright. Inspector, he acknowledged coolly. I understand you wish to discuss my daughter. Yes, Sir William. I regret to inform you that we've discovered human remains that we believe belong to Elizabeth. If Harrington was shocked, he didn't show it. His face remained impassive, though his hand, resting on his desk, tightened visibly. There must be some mistake, he said finally. My daughter lives in Scotland with her husband. When did you last hear from her, sir? Some months ago. Christmas, I believe. And before that? A flicker of irritation crossed Harrington's face. We're not close, Inspector. Elizabeth chose to leave this family in a most irregular manner. Our communications are infrequent. I see, Wallace said. Would you happen to have kept any of her letters? I don't believe so, Harrington replied too quickly. My wife might have. She's more sentimental about these matters. I'd very much like to see them, Wallace pressed. And I'll need a sample of Elizabeth's handwriting from before she left. Harrington's eyes narrowed slightly. May I ask why? Standard procedure. Wallace lied smoothly. To confirm identity. I'll see what can be found, Harrington conceded reluctantly. One more thing, Wallace added. The sapphire ring mentioned in your original report. Did Elizabeth ever return it? I understand it was a family heirloom. Something flickered in Harrington's eyes. No, he said after a moment. She kept it. Against my wishes. As they prepared to leave, a young man appeared in the doorway of the study. He had Harrington's height but none of his imposing presence. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously between the police officers and his father. Father, is everything all right? Police business, Richard, Harrington said dismissively. Nothing for you to concern yourself with. Richard Harrington's gaze lingered on Wallace. There was something in his expression. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. It's about Elizabeth, isn't it? Richard asked quietly. Before his father could answer, Wallace stepped forward. Yes, Mr. Harrington. We found what we believe are your sister's remains. Richard's face drained of what little color it had. That's impossible, he whispered. She's in Scotland. When did you last hear from her? Wallace asked. I don't recall precisely. Sir William cut in sharply. Inspector, my son is unwell. He suffered terribly with his nerves after his war service. I must insist you direct your questions to me. Outside in the motor car, Parker glanced at Wallace. They're hiding something. Oh yes, Wallace agreed. The question is what? And why? Wallace's next stop was a modest boarding house in Bloomsbury. Here lived Lieutenant Edward Pierce. The young officer Elizabeth had supposedly eloped with 7 years ago. The landlady showed them to a small room on the second floor. Poor Mr. Pierce, she whispered. Not been the same since he came back from the war. Shell shock, they said. Edward Pierce sat by the window, staring out at the street below. He was handsome still, despite the premature lines around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. He didn't turn when they entered. Lieutenant Pierce, Wallace said gently. I'm Detective Inspector Wallace. May I speak with you about Elizabeth Harrington? At the name, Pierce turned sharply. Elizabeth. His voice was hoarse from disuse. You found her. The hope in his voice told Wallace everything he needed to know. You never married her, did you? Wallace asked. Pierce's shoulders slumped. I was to meet her the night before I shipped out. We were going to elope, just as we'd planned. His voice broke. But she never came. Did you try to find her? Of course I did, Pierce said, a flash of the officer he once was coming through. I went to her house, but they turned me away. Said she'd left a note saying she'd changed her mind. Then I was shipped to France the next day. When did you start receiving her letters? Pierce looked confused. Letters? I never received any letters from her. I wrote to her constantly, but she never replied. Wallace leaned forward. The Harrington family has been receiving letters from someone claiming to be Elizabeth for the past 7 years. Letters saying she married you and moved to Scotland. Pierce's face contorted with anger. That's a lie. I searched for her when I returned. No one in her family would speak to me. They said she wanted nothing to do with me. Do you still have the letters you wrote to her? Some, Pierce said. I kept copies of a few. Foolish habit from a desperate man. As Pierce retrieved a small bundle of letters from a drawer, Wallace noted how carefully they were preserved, despite the man's otherwise disordered existence. She was going to bring it, Pierce said suddenly. Her grandmother's sapphire ring. She said it was the only thing she wanted to take from that house. She was wearing it when I last saw her. Wallace accepted the letters. Lieutenant Pierce, I regret to inform you that we've found human remains that we believe are Elizabeth's. She never left London. Pierce stared at him, uncomprehending. Then, slowly, the realization dawned in his eyes. No, he whispered. No, that's not possible. I'm afraid it is, Wallace said gently. And I need your help to find out what happened to her. The handwriting analysis came back the next day. The report was unequivocal. The letters sent to the Harrington family, supposedly from Elizabeth, were forgeries. Skillful ones, but forgeries nonetheless. 7 years of letters, Parker marveled, laying out the samples they'd collected. Someone went to a lot of trouble. But why? Wallace wondered aloud. Why maintain the pretense for so long? To cover up her murder, Parker suggested. Yes, but this is beyond covering tracks, Wallace said. This was a maintaining of fiction. Keeping her alive on paper while she lay in an unmarked grave. He turned to the cemetery records they'd obtained. The plot where Elizabeth was found had been owned by the cemetery itself until 1920, when it was sold to a man named James Smith. Smith, Wallace scoffed. Might as well have signed it anonymous. We've checked, Parker confirmed. No record of this James Smith anywhere. Paid cash for the plot but never used it. He didn't need to use it, Wallace pointed out. He already had. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young constable entered carrying a slim folder. The report on the Harrington finances, sir. Wallace took it with interest. He'd requested a discreet inquiry into the family's financial dealings over the past 7 years. The report painted an interesting picture. Shortly after Elizabeth's disappearance, Sir William had handled a series of sensitive cases for several prominent industrialists. His earnings had increased substantially. More interestingly, his son Richard had received regular payments from an unknown source starting in 1919, 2 years after Elizabeth's disappearance. "Follow the money," Wallace murmured. His next visit took him to the offices of the family solicitor, a dry stick of a man named Herbert Simmons, who reluctantly confirmed that Elizabeth had been set to inherit a substantial sum from her maternal grandmother upon her 21st birthday, which would have been just 3 months after she disappeared. "What happened to the inheritance?" Wallace asked. In the absence of Miss Harrington, and with proof she was living abroad with her husband, the money was divided according to the secondary provisions of her grandmother's will, Simmons explained stiffly. "Between Sir William and his son Richard." Wallace nodded slowly. "And if Elizabeth had died before her 21st birthday? The same provision would apply. So financially, her disappearance and her death would yield the same result for her father and brother?" Simmons looked distinctly uncomfortable. "I suppose that's accurate, yes." "One more question," Wallace said. "Did Elizabeth ever consult you privately, without her father's knowledge?" Simmons hesitated. "Professional privilege, Inspector. This is a murder investigation, Mr. Simmons." The solicitor sighed. "She came to me once, about 2 weeks before she disappeared. She wanted to know if there was any way she could access her inheritance early. She was planning to leave home, she said." "And was there?" "No," Simmons said. "Not without her father's approval, which she knew would not be forthcoming if she intended to marry Lieutenant Pierce." "Did you tell Sir William about this meeting?" Simmons's silence was answer enough. That evening, Wallace returned to the cemetery. The winter darkness had fallen early, and frost was already forming on the headstones. He wanted to see the site again to understand why someone would choose this specific location. The caretaker's cottage was still lit. Thomas Finch answered his knock, surprised to find the inspector on his doorstep. "Something else you need, Inspector?" "Just trying to understand why that particular spot was chosen," Wallace explained. Finch considered this. "It's quiet there, away from the main paths. Not many visitors to that section." "Was it always that way? Even 7 years ago?" "No," Finch said thoughtfully. "That whole north section was closed for some landscaping work back then. Drainage problems. We only reopened it in 19. So in 1917, that area would have been deserted," Finch confirmed. "Fenced off. No one going in or out except workers." "Were you working here then?" But mostly on the south side. The north section work was handled by contractors, brought in their own laborers." Finch paused. "Come to think of it, there was a bit of trouble with 2 of them. Brothers, I think. Got into a fight with one of our regular groundskeepers. Crawford sacked them." "Do you remember their names?" Finch shook his head. "Something common. Miller, maybe? Or Martin. It was a long time ago." "What about the groundskeeper they fought with?" "Oh, that'd be old Jenkins. He's still here, lives in the cottage on the far side." Jenkins was even older than Finch, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his back permanently stooped from decades of digging. His cottage smelled of damp and tobacco. "The Martin brothers," he wheezed, after Wallace explained his interest. "Nasty pieces of work, those 2. William and Robert. Had no respect for the dead." "What did you fight about?" Jenkins's rheumy eyes narrowed. "Caught them digging after hours. Said they were fixing drainage, but they weren't anywhere near the drainage works. When I questioned them, the bigger one, William, took a swing at me." "Where exactly were they digging?" "North section. Not far from where you found that poor girl." Wallace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "Did you report this?" "To Crawford, yes. He let them go. Police weren't interested in a couple of laborers having a punch-up." "Did you ever see them again after they were sacked?" Jenkins was silent for a moment, his gnarled hands fidgeting with his pipe. "Once," he said finally. "About 2 years later. Middle of the night, I was making my rounds. Saw someone in that same section. When I got closer, I recognized the bigger one, William. He ran off when he saw me. He was digging? No, Jenkins said. He was just standing there, like he was visiting a grave. The sapphire ring proved to be the key that began to unlock the case. It surfaced not in a pawn shop, as Wallace had expected, but on the hand of Lady Diana Blackwood, wife of industrialist Sir Henry Blackwood, one of Sir William Harrington's most prominent clients. Wallace had been invited to a charity function by his superior, who thought the case needed a more delicate touch, given the social standing of those involved. It was there he noticed the distinctive ring gleaming on Lady Blackwood's finger as she lifted a champagne glass. "Admiring my ring, Inspector?" she asked, catching his gaze. "My husband gave it to me for our anniversary last year." "Family heirloom," he said. "It's quite distinctive," Wallace remarked. "I don't believe I've seen a setting quite like it." Sir Henry said it was continental work. "From Vienna, I believe." "May I?" Wallace asked, gesturing to her hand. Lady Blackwood extended her fingers with a bemused smile. Wallace examined the ring carefully, a large sapphire surrounded by diamonds in a unique filigree setting. Inside the band, barely visible, were the initials MH. "Margaret Harrington," Wallace murmured. "I beg your pardon?" Lady Blackwood asked, withdrawing her hand. "Nothing," Wallace said smoothly. "Thank you for indulging my curiosity." The next morning, Wallace visited the jeweler who had cleaned and sized the ring for Lady Blackwood. The jeweler confirmed that the ring had been brought in by Sir Henry approximately 18 months ago. He mentioned he'd acquired it recently and wanted it sized for his wife, the jeweler explained. "Beautiful piece. 18th century Austrian work. Quite valuable." "Did he mention where he acquired it?" "From a private seller, I believe. He said the previous owner had fallen on hard times." Wallace's next visit was to the offices of Blackwood Industries, where Sir Henry greeted him with the forced joviality of a man with much to hide. "Inspector, what can I do for the Metropolitan Police today?" "I'm investigating the murder of Elizabeth Harrington," Wallace said without preamble. The smile froze on Blackwood's face. "Harrington? William's daughter? I understood she was living in Scotland." "That fiction has been disproven," Wallace said. "Her body was discovered in Highgate Cemetery. She was murdered in 1917. Blackwood's complexion had turned ashen." "How unfortunate. But I fail to see how this concerns me. I noticed your wife wearing a rather distinctive ring at the Ashworth charity function. A sapphire in an Austrian setting." "My wife's jewelry is hardly police business," Blackwood snapped. "It is when said jewelry was stolen from a murder victim," Wallace replied evenly. "Elizabeth Harrington was wearing that ring the night she disappeared. It's a family heirloom, passed down from her grandmother Margaret Harrington, whose initials are engraved inside the band." Blackwood's bluster collapsed. I didn't know. I purchased it in good faith." "From whom?" "A private seller. Through an intermediary." "This intermediary having a name?" Blackwood hesitated. "Richard Harrington." The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Wallace returned to the station and summoned Parker. "I need everything we can find on William and Robert Martin," he instructed. "Former laborers at Highgate Cemetery in 1917. And I want to know every property owned by Blackwood Industries, particularly any near the cemetery." The results came back faster than expected. The Martin brothers had both served brief prison sentences for assault prior to their employment at the cemetery. After 1917, William Martin had begun working as a private groundskeeper for a property in Hampstead, owned by a subsidiary of Blackwood Industries. Robert Martin had taken similar employment at Sir William Harrington's country estate in Kent. Most interestingly, both had received substantial sums from Richard Harrington in 1919, the same year that James Smith had purchased the cemetery plot where Elizabeth's body was found. "We need to find these brothers," Wallace told Parker. "And I think I know who can help us." Richard Harrington was drinking alone in his club when Wallace found him. He looked up with undisguised fear as the inspector approached his table. "Mr. Harrington," Wallace said, taking a seat without invitation. I think it's time we had a proper conversation about your sister. Richard's hand trembled, spilling his brandy. I've told you everything I know. No, Wallace said quietly. You haven't. You've lied to protect your father. You've lied to protect yourself. And you've lied to protect the men who killed Elizabeth. You can't prove any of that, Richard whispered. Actually, I can, Wallace countered. I know about the ring. I know about the payments to the Martin brothers. I know about the plot purchased under the name James Smith. And I know about the visit to Elizabeth's unmarked grave 2 years after her death. Richard's face crumpled. It wasn't supposed to happen, he said, his voice barely audible. No one was supposed to get hurt. Tell me, Wallace said simply. And finally Richard did. The night Elizabeth disappeared, she had indeed planned to elope with Lieutenant Pierce. Richard had discovered her intention and informed their father, who had already learned of Elizabeth's attempt to access her inheritance early. Sir William, furious at the prospect of his daughter marrying a man he considered beneath their family station, and equally furious at potentially losing control of her inheritance, had instructed Richard to arrange for Elizabeth to be intercepted before she could meet Pierce. Richard had hired the Martin brothers, who had previously done discreet work for one of Blackwood's less reputable businesses. They were supposed to simply detain Elizabeth until her intended had shipped out to France, then return her home where she could be kept under stricter supervision. But things had gone horribly wrong. The brothers had been drinking. When Elizabeth fought back, they became violent. One of them, Richard wasn't sure which, had strangled her with her own scarf. Panicked, they had brought her body to Richard, who had immediately gone to his father. Sir William, ever the pragmatist, had seen an opportunity rather than a tragedy. With Elizabeth gone, her inheritance would come to him and Richard. All they needed to do was conceal her death. The Martin brothers, who were working at Highgate at the time, had suggested burying her in the closed north section of the cemetery where no one would discover her. Sir William agreed, and to ensure their silence, promised them future employment and eventual payment once the inheritance was secured. The letters were Richard's idea. A former university classmate with a talent for forgery provided the ongoing proof of life needed to avoid any investigation into Elizabeth's disappearance. The sapphire ring had been removed from her body by the Martin brothers as payment for their silence, but Richard had later retrieved it when its significance as a family heirloom became clear. 2 years after the murder, William Martin had grown increasingly unstable, making vague threats about revealing the truth. Richard had arranged to meet him at the grave to pay him off again. It was then that Jenkins, the groundskeeper, had spotted him. Frightened by the close call, Richard had decided to legitimize the burial site by purchasing the plot under a false name, ensuring it wouldn't be resold or disturbed. He never imagined that 7 years later, a particularly harsh winter would lead to the discovery that unraveled the entire deception. And the ring? Wallace asked. How did it end up with Blackwood? Father needed Blackwood's help with some legal matters, Richard said dully. Matters that required discretion. The ring was part of the payment. Father told him it was a family piece we were willing to part with. So your father knew everything? From the beginning. Richard nodded miserably. He saw it as a problem to be solved. Elizabeth had always been difficult, he said. Headstrong. This was simply the consequence of her poor judgment. And you went along with it, Wallace said, his voice hardening. What choice did I have? Richard's eyes pleaded for understanding. He was my father. I was weak. I've always been weak. Wallace stood. Richard Harrington, I'm arresting you as an accessory to the murder of Elizabeth Harrington. You do not have to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. As he led the broken man out, Wallace reflected that Richard's weakness would likely save him from the gallows. His testimony against his father and the Martin brothers would be invaluable to the prosecution. Sir William, with his connections, would be a more challenging target, but the evidence was mounting. The Martin brothers were picked up the next day, William at Blackwood's Hampstead property, Robert at the Harrington country estate. Neither resisted arrest. Years of guilt and alcohol had taken their toll on both men. In a surprising turn, It was Robert who offered a full confession, perhaps hoping to mitigate his sentence. His account largely matched Richard's, with one significant difference. It was Sir William himself who had ordered them to make sure she couldn't cause any more trouble if she resisted their efforts to detain her. He said if she wouldn't listen to reason, we should make sure she couldn't run off with that lieutenant, Robert explained flatly. Said his daughter would rather be dead than disgrace the family with that match. Whether this was an explicit order for murder or merely a figure of speech misinterpreted by the brothers would become a central question at the trial. The case of the Crown versus Sir William Harrington, Richard Harrington, William Martin, and Robert Martin began at the Old Bailey on a cold morning in March 1925. The public galleries were packed, and newspapers published special editions covering every detail of what they termed the Winter Grave Murder. Sir William had engaged the finest defense barrister in London, while Richard and the Martin brothers were represented by court-appointed counsel. Sir William had maintained his innocence throughout, claiming that while he had helped conceal his daughter's death after the fact, a serious but lesser crime, he had never ordered or contemplated her murder. Wallace watched from the witness stand as Sir William presented a facade of dignified grief for the court. He spoke of his shock and horror upon learning of his beloved daughter's death, claiming that Richard had presented him with a fait accompli that he had foolishly helped conceal to protect what remained of my family. It was a masterful performance, one that might have swayed the jury had it not been for three key pieces of evidence that Wallace and the prosecution had meticulously assembled. First were the financial records showing that Sir William had begun transferring assets in anticipation of receiving Elizabeth's inheritance before her death, suggesting premeditation. Second was the testimony of Edward Pierce, who recounted a confrontation with Sir William a week before Elizabeth's disappearance, during which the older man had threatened that he would rather see her in the ground than married to a man of Pierce's station. But it was the third piece of evidence that proved most damning: the letters. Not the forged letters supposedly from Elizabeth, but earlier letters found in a hidden compartment of Sir William's desk. Letters that Elizabeth had written to her grandmother before that lady's death, expressing fear of her father's growing financial troubles and his increasing attempts to control her inheritance. Most crucially, a letter dated just 3 days before her disappearance. Dearest Margaret, I am resolved to leave with Edward tomorrow night. Father has forbidden it in the strongest terms, going so far as to threaten consequences that made my blood run cold. I take with me your ring as both blessing and protection. By the time you receive this, I shall be Mrs. Edward Pierce, and beyond Father's reach forever. Margaret, Elizabeth's friend and namesake, not her grandmother as Wallace had initially assumed, had preserved the letters and brought them forward after reading about the case in the newspapers. The trial lasted 3 weeks. In the end, William Martin was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Robert Martin, considered an accessory and having provided state's evidence, received 15 years hard labor. Richard Harrington, having cooperated fully and shown genuine remorse, was convicted of being an accessory after the fact and sentenced to 10 years. And Sir William Harrington, despite his protestations of innocence, was found guilty of conspiracy to murder. The judge, in delivering his sentence of life imprisonment, noted the cold calculation and extraordinary callousness with which he had treated his own daughter's death. As Sir William was led from the dock, his carefully maintained facade finally crumbled. "She was going to ruin everything," he shouted. "Everything I had built. Everything I had sacrificed for. She owed me her loyalty." Wallace watched him go, thinking of Elizabeth Harrington and the future that had been stolen from her. A young woman whose only crime had been the desire to chart her own course, to marry for love rather than family advancement. On a clear spring day in 1925, Elizabeth Harrington was properly laid to rest in Highgate Cemetery. Her sapphire ring, recovered from Lady Blackwood and returned to its rightful owner, adorned her finger once more. Edward Pierce stood at the graveside, supported by Margaret, the friend who had kept Elizabeth's letters all those years. Though still damaged by his war experiences and the loss of the woman he had loved, there was a certain peace in his expression now that justice had been served. Inspector Wallace observed the small funeral from a respectful distance. His leg pained him in the damp spring air, but he stood straight, head held against his chest. Parker joined him as the service concluded. "You look thoughtful, sir." "Just reflecting on time," Wallace replied. 7 years she lay there, forgotten by everyone except those who put her there. "Not forgotten now," Parker noted. "No," Wallace agreed. "Not forgotten now." As they turned to leave, Wallace cast one final glance back at the grave. The frozen ground of winter had given up its secret, and in doing so, had finally granted Elizabeth Harrington the truth, justice, and peace she deserved. The bitter cold that had made digging her grave so difficult had, 7 years later, led to her discovery. There was a symmetry to it that appealed to Wallace's sense of order. The winter that had concealed her had ultimately revealed her. And in that revelation, despite all the darkness it had exposed, there was a kind of redemption. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please support us. It just takes a like, a comment, and subscription. There is a lot of hard work involved in creation of this story. Your support gives us motivation for keeping up this amazing work.